There are stories whispered in the cracks of history that were never meant for human ears, stories so vile, so corrupted, that even speaking them aloud feels like crossing a threshold you can never return from. This is one of those stories, a tale that begins with a girl no older than 17, lying pale and broken in a hospital bed in the autumn of 1971, carrying inside her not just a child, but the culmination of a secret breeding program her family had been cultivating for over a century. What emerged from her womb that day was not a baby as you or I would understand it. It was something else, something that medical professionals could not explain and that federal agents moved swiftly to bury. But before we descend into that delivery room, before we peel back the bandages on this wound of history, I need you to do something. Tell me in the comments right now, where are you watching this from, and what is time at there? Because tonight, no matter where you sit, you and I are walking into the mountains of Appalachia together, into a place where outsiders were never welcome and where bloodlines were guarded like holy relics. By the end of this story, you won't see family, faith, or even humanity in the same way again. The Whitakers. That was their name. To most Americans, just another backwoods surname. But in a forgotten corner of Virginia, that name carried the weight of something much older, something far darker than the soil it grew from. In 1847, a man named Joshua Whitaker claimed a stretch of land so desolate and unwanted that no other settler dared stay. The winters there stripped men down to bone and shadow, the soil yielded nothing but thorns, and the mist clung to the hollows like a curse that would never lift. But Joshua wasn't searching for prosperity, he was searching for isolation. He wanted distance from the prying eyes of civilization because he carried with him a secret mission. He brought 2 wives, sisters, Martha and Rebecca, and he planted not just crops but a doctrine. His children would not marry outsiders. They would not dilute the bloodline. Joshua told them their family had been chosen, touched by God with a divine essence, and that essence must be protected, preserved, intensified. And from that twisted seed, a family tree began to grow, but it did not grow upward. It looped back in on itself, again and again and again. By the time Sarah May Whitaker was born in 1954, the family's blood had been folded, pressed, and recycled for over 5 generations. The result? Children who never spoke. Infants who died minutes after birth, their tiny bodies malformed by genetics collapsing in on themselves. Young men with eyes like dead glass, staring through neighbors who crossed too close to the Whitaker land. Whispers spread across the valleys that the Whitakers were cursed, that their hollow was haunted by something far worse than ghosts. But within the family, they called it perfection. They believed every lost child, every twisted limb, every mind born fractured, was not failure, but a necessary offering to the blood. Each generation brought them closer, they believed, to what Joshua Whitaker had promised, the perfect circle, a state of purity that would lift them above ordinary mankind. And Sarah May, poor, trembling, obedient Sarah May, was to be the vessel. Her pregnancy at 17 was not an accident. It was ritual. It was calculated. Her belly stretched until her skin grew translucent, the veins beneath writhing as though alive. She wasted away, hair falling in clumps, teeth loosening and dropping from her gums. And yet, the elders of the family rejoiced. They said this was it. This was the child their blood had been working toward for over a century. What Sarah May carried inside her was not just a child. It was the culmination of a dark design. And when the day came to deliver it, the doctors would witness something that should never have been born into this world. But here's the truth you must hold on to as we continue. What happened in that delivery room was not just the horror of one family's corruption. The classified files, locked away for 50 years, suggest something far more sinister. This was not just incest, not just madness. This was a program, a formula, a design that echoes far beyond the Whitakers. You're not supposed to know this, and once you do, you will never think of family, blood, or control in the same way again. The descent into this nightmare begins not in the hospital of 1971, but in the wilderness of 1847. Imagine Joshua Whitaker standing on that barren ridge of Virginia land, 2 wives beside him, a Bible in one hand, and something much darker coiled in the other, an idea. You see, Joshua was not an ignorant frontiersman. He was literate, educated in ways he never explained. His journals, hidden beneath floorboards and uncovered a century later, reveal he had studied not only scripture, but old texts from Europe. Manuals of blood purity, genealogical records of monarchies, and the whispered philosophies of secret societies obsessed with lineage. He was convinced that blood carried more than life. It carried essence, power, divinity itself, and he believed that if he controlled that essence, he could create something greater than man. Most settlers came to Appalachia chasing freedom, but Joshua came to erase it. He wanted total control, the kind only isolation could grant. In the hollers where neighbors were scarce and questions dangerous, he laid the foundation of what would become the Whitaker Doctrine: the circle must not break. His first children were born of both sisters, Martha and Rebecca, raised not as siblings but as participants in an experiment. By the time they reached adolescence, Joshua had already planted the next phase of his vision. He forbade them from seeking partners outside the family. Instead, he arranged unions between brothers and sisters, cousins and cousins, enforcing the belief that every other bloodline was corrupted by sin. Outsiders were liars, thieves, mongrels. Only the Whitaker line was chosen, marked by God, or by something Joshua called the source. Neighbors noticed. They whispered about children with strange gaits, about eyes too pale, about children who didn't speak until they were 10. By the 1880s, no doctor in the valley would attend a Whitaker birth, but the family didn't need outsiders anymore. They had become a closed loop, and Joshua had already taught them that secrecy was salvation. If anyone came too close, the family answered with silence or violence. But secrecy wasn't their only shield. They cloaked their madness in ritual. Each birth was surrounded by prayers in a dialect outsiders couldn't understand, chants about the circle growing tighter. The women were treated not as wives or daughters, but as vessels of purity. And as generations passed, the line of distinction between father, brother, cousin, and son collapsed into nothing. To the Whitakers, these words lost all meaning. To them, there was only family, and family was everything. By the turn of the century, the doctrine had evolved into something even darker. They created what they called the rotation system. Each fertile woman was assigned multiple partners in a sequence: uncle, brother, grandfather, cousin, so that no one branch of the family tree ever weakened. They were not breeding as humans do, but as breeders of livestock, calculating, recording, treating their bloodline like a sacred herd. Every child born was catalogued. Those who survived were exalted. Those who didn't were buried without ceremony, the family calling them offerings to the circle. The deeper you look, the more this stops feeling like ignorance and starts looking like intent. Because when scientists finally analyzed the Whitaker bloodline in the 1970s, they found something staggering. The mutations were not random. They followed a pattern: impossible, deliberate, precise. But Joshua couldn't have known genetics. He died long before DNA was discovered. So how did he create a breeding system that mirrored principles only modern science would uncover a century later? Was he simply deranged, or was he carrying knowledge from somewhere else? Knowledge he wasn't supposed to have. The journals hint at an answer. He wrote about visitations, angels clothed in smoke, beings who told him the blood must be purified, that the world beyond the mountains was falling into corruption, and only his family could preserve what was divine. Were these visions the ravings of a madman, or something darker feeding him a script? What we know is this. By the time Sarah May was born in 1954, the circle had been tightening for over 100 years. The Whitakers no longer lived like the world outside. They had their own language, their own rules, their own terrifying sense of purpose. And Sarah May, she was born into that purpose. She was raised to be a vessel for the culmination. And when her body began to wither under the weight of her impossible pregnancy, when her veins writhed beneath translucent skin, her family didn't weep. They celebrated. They believed she was birthing their Messiah. But what came from her womb wasn't salvation. It was something else. Something that made 3 doctors abandon the delivery room, never to return. And the federal agents who arrived days later, they weren't there to protect the public. They were there to protect the secret. The night of October 13th, 1971, the delivery room of Mercy General Hospital was cold, fluorescent, and unprepared for what was about to enter it. Sarah May Whitaker had been carried there unconscious, her body little more than a husk wrapped around a swelling womb. The doctors assumed it would be like any other rural case, another malnourished girl in trouble, another sad tragedy of Appalachian poverty. But the moment her family walked through those doors, the atmosphere changed. They came in a procession, men with pale, vacant eyes and expressions carved from stone, women whispering in a language the nurses didn't recognize. They carried bundles wrapped in cloth, photographs, strange wooden carvings, stones marked with symbols no one had seen before. When the staff asked what they were for, the men only stared, and then, almost in unison, they said, "The culmination." Dr. Margaret Powell had been delivering babies for over 20 years. She had seen breech births, stillbirths, infants born with deformities so severe they could not survive more than minutes. But when the first waves of contraction shook Sarah May's body, something happened that froze the entire room. The fetal monitor began producing signals unlike any she had seen. Instead of the steady pulse of a heartbeat, it displayed bursts, clusters of electrical activity that looked less like cardiac rhythm and more like the patterns of brainwaves. The nurses checked the equipment, thinking it was malfunctioning. It wasn't. And then came the sound. Every mother carries the heartbeat of her child like a hidden drum. But what echoed from Sarah May's belly wasn't a heartbeat. It was something lower, stranger, almost like whispering, a vibration that seemed to fill the air, as though the child inside her was not just alive, but aware. The staff exchanged terrified glances. The Whitaker men only smiled. The labor stretched into hours. Sarah May never woke. Her body convulsed violently, ribs snapping under the force of contractions. Blood vessels burst in her eyes until the whites were swallowed in crimson. At 4:17 in the morning, with a scream that did not come from Sarah's mouth but seemed to tear itself from the walls of the room, the child entered the world. The silence that followed was not relief. It was terror. The infant was alive, breathing, moving. But nothing about it belonged to human design. Its head was grotesquely enlarged, the skin stretched so thin you could see the brain inside, except it was not a brain as textbooks described. Instead of folds, it was segmented into clusters, each one pulsing independently like organs of thought beating in separate rhythms. Its limbs twisted at impossible angles, fingers branching and spiraling, legs fused into a coil that resembled roots more than flesh. And the face, if you could call it that. There were three, not separate but overlapping, features bleeding into each other, mouths opening and closing soundlessly, eyes blinking in random sequence. It looked less like a child and more like the echo of a scream frozen into flesh. One nurse fainted, another fled the room sobbing. Dr. Powell forced herself to keep her hands steady, but the truth sank into her chest like a weight. This was not a medical anomaly. This was something else, something designed. And then, as the child drew its first breath, every monitor in the room flickered. Lights dimmed. The whispering sound swelled into a hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls. For a moment, everyone present felt it, not in their ears, but in their bones. The infant's eyes, all of them, moved in unison for the first time, and fixed directly on its family. The Whitakers stepped forward, reverent, murmuring prayers in their secret dialect. To them, this was victory, the culmination, the proof that their blood had not been corrupted but elevated. They pressed their hands against the glass of the incubator, chanting words no one else understood. The doctors shouted for them to step back. They did not move. And then, the most disturbing part of all, the child responded. Its lips moved in rhythm with their chants, not crying, not wailing, mimicking. Its twisted body quivered as if answering. That was the moment 3 doctors abandoned the delivery room. One would never practice medicine again. Sarah May's body, drained and ruined, lay silent. Within 72 hours, she would be dead. But her child, This impossible fusion of flesh and secret blood would live for 6 days. 6 days that rewrote the limits of medicine, broke the faith of every nurse in that room, and drew the attention of forces far beyond the hospital. Because when the government arrived, they didn't come to help. They came to collect. The child should not have lived beyond its first breath. Every deformity pointed to death. Lungs underdeveloped, organs malformed, brain a fractured mosaic that should not have sustained thought or movement. Yet as the first night passed, the monitors confirmed what the medical textbooks could not explain. The infant was alive. Not merely alive, but adapting. On day 1, it made no sound. Not a cry, not a whimper. Nothing that resembled a human newborn. Instead, it released a low hum. At first, the nurses thought it was the whir of the incubator, but then they realized the sound was pulsing in perfect rhythm with the child's breathing. A resonance. A vibration that made glass tremble on nearby trays. When family members spoke in their strange dialect, the hum shifted tone, as if answering. On day 2, the eyes moved, not in random chaos but with intention. Each pair of eyes tracked different objects simultaneously, one following a nurse across the room, another locking on the swinging chain of a pocket watch, another staring unblinking into the overhead light. But when its family approached, all the eyes aligned, fixing on them with a focus so intense it unsettled even the doctors hardened by decades of practice. On day 3, the staff began reporting phenomena they couldn't explain. Lights flickered whenever the child stirred. Equipment malfunctioned without cause. More disturbing still, several nurses described hearing whispers when alone in the room, words just beyond recognition, as though a voice was speaking from beneath the hum of electricity. At first they thought it was exhaustion, but when they compared notes they realized they had heard the same phrase repeated in different tones. The circle is closing. On day 4, the family escalated their rituals. They brought in carved symbols, stones etched with spirals, and laid them near the incubator. They sang in low, droning voices, and the child responded. The monitors recorded a spike in its irregular brainwaves whenever the rituals began. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the floor, rattling the cabinets, until one nurse swore she felt it in her teeth. Dr. Powell demanded the objects be removed. The Whitaker men refused. On day 5, something happened that broke the last fragments of disbelief. The child moved. Not in the way malformed infants sometimes twitch, but with coordination. Its fused limbs twisted into grotesque spirals, shifted into a shape no one thought possible. Slowly, deliberately, it bent itself into a coil, a spiral, a perfect circle. The nurses screamed. The family fell to their knees in worship. The child's 3 faces, frozen until then in contorted grimaces, relaxed. All 3 smiled. And then came the strangest part of all. The humming stopped. For the first time, the room fell silent. And from the child's overlapping mouths came a single sound, laughter. Not the giggle of a baby, but something older, something broken. It didn't last long, only a few seconds, but it was enough to silence every person in that room. On day 6, the child began to dissolve. Not bleed, not decay, dissolve. The translucent skin darkened in patches as the organs beneath seemed to collapse inward, folding on themselves. Yet the child did not appear to suffer. Its faces, all 3, wore an expression of serenity. The hum returned, softer now, like a chant fading into memory. And as dawn broke, the infant curled again into that impossible spiral and died. The Whitaker family wept. The doctors stood in stunned silence. For them, the nightmare was over. For the Whitakers, it had only just begun. Because within hours, unmarked black vehicles rolled into the hospital parking lot. Men in dark suits stepped out, briefcases in hand. They were not from the local authorities. They were not from the state. They claimed to be from the Centers for Disease Control. But their questions, their methods, their silence said otherwise. The unmarked cars rolled in before sunrise. No sirens, no lights, no insignias. Just matte black sedans and a paneled truck large enough to hold equipment no hospital had ever seen. The men who stepped out were not sheriffs, not doctors, not anyone Mercy General staff recognized. They wore dark suits, crisp and anonymous, carrying leather briefcases that looked heavier than paper should allow. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with silver hair and no name tag, introduced himself only as Director Harris, Centers for Disease Control, but something in his eyes betrayed the lie. The first thing they did was isolate the delivery room. Armed guards, quiet, efficient, posted at every door. The second thing they did was confiscate the records. Charts, photographs, fetal monitor printouts, all scooped into black cases, as if the doctors had imagined it all. When Dr. Powell demanded to know under whose authority they were operating, Harris cut her down with a sentence she would never forget. "You saw nothing. You delivered nothing. You will remember nothing." One by one, the witnesses were taken into a side room. A nurse emerged minutes later, trembling, refusing to speak. Another followed, then quit her position within the week. Rumors swirled that they had been forced to sign non-disclosure agreements, but the truth was darker. Each one described being shown a single sheet of paper covered in dense text, legal codes they didn't understand, followed by a warning: "Speak of this again, and your license, your home, your life would dissolve in ways you couldn't stop." But it wasn't just threats. Some spoke of injections, immunizations, the agents called them, a precaution against contamination. Yet afterward, the nurses reported strange side effects, memory gaps, sudden migraines, fragments of dreams that felt too real. It was as though the injections didn't just protect them, I erased them. Meanwhile, the child's body was taken, not to the morgue, but to the truck outside, sealed in a reinforced container, guarded as if it were a weapon, which perhaps it was. Harris ordered the family kept at a distance, but the Whitakers resisted. They wailed, clawed, demanded their Messiah back. When one of the men in black raised a hand against them, the child's grandmother stepped forward, an ancient woman with hair white as ash, and whispered something into his ear. Witnesses claimed his face drained of all color. He dropped his weapon, stumbled back, and refused to re-enter the building. No one ever recorded what she said. Within 24 hours, the case was gone. No death certificate for Sarah May, no medical records of the child. The room where it was born was stripped bare, every surface sterilized until no trace of blood or memory remained. To the outside world, it had never happened. But here's where the story fractures into something larger. Because in the years that followed, rumors leaked, not from the family but from inside the government itself, whispers of a pattern X, a genetic anomaly tracked across multiple bloodlines in America, files suggesting the Whitakers were not unique but part of a broader study, notes describing families in Kentucky, Tennessee, even as far as West Virginia, isolated clans with the same mutations, the same whispers of rituals, the same obsession with purity. The Whitakers were not an accident. They were data. And if the files are to be believed, the government didn't just observe. They encouraged, funded, manipulated. Because whatever Sarah May carried in her womb was not merely the product of incest and isolation, it was the result of design. A design that had been in motion for generations. The Whitakers were only the surface wound. The deeper infection, the part hidden under scar tissue, was discovered in the files that surfaced years later, documents stamped with property of the Department of Health and Human Services on the outside, but bearing the fingerprints of agencies that officially did not exist. Within them was a term repeated again and again: Pattern X. Pattern X was not a family. It was not even a place. It was a map. A network of bloodlines scattered like broken glass across the Appalachian spine. Families who lived in valleys so deep that sunlight barely touched them, who married only their kin, who guarded their secrets with rifles and silence. To outsiders, these families were the forgotten poor, casualties of isolation. But to the men who compiled the files, they were something else entirely: experiments. The first documented Pattern X family was recorded in 1912 in Clay County, Kentucky. A boy was born with what local doctors described as cranial overdevelopment, a polite way of saying his head was grotesquely enlarged. But when the child turned 4, something happened that no medical textbook could explain. He began speaking in complete sentences in 3 different languages no one in his family nor his community could possibly know. Within weeks, he was dead. The attending physician filed a report. That report disappeared. The second appeared in 1936 in a hollowed valley of Tennessee. A girl born blind, her eyes reduced to milky orbs, yet she described in vivid detail the features of strangers she had never met, the landscapes of cities she had never seen. She predicted a fire that consumed her family's home 3 days before it happened. Her case was forwarded to a government bureau in Washington. She vanished soon after. The third, in 1952, just 2 years before Sarah May's birth, surfaced in Fayette County, West Virginia. A stillborn infant with a body twisted into a spiral, its vertebrae fused into the shape of a perfect circle. The doctor who delivered it wrote in his notes, "Not human, cannot be explained," requesting immediate guidance. By the following week, the doctor had lost his license. His notes, like all the others, were gone. The files revealed that these weren't isolated tragedies. They were data points in a pattern, each separated by decades, but each bound by common traits: generational inbreeding, obsessive secrecy, mutations that bent biology into symbols. Always the spiral, always the circle. By the 1960s, internal memoranda show the government was no longer just tracking these families. They were intervening, providing welfare assistance that was little more than surveillance funding, dispatching doctors to study children under the guise of rural health programs. In some cases, they relocated entire families, moving them into controlled environments under fabricated identities. The justification was buried in bureaucratic jargon: genetic containment, monitoring anomalous heritable traits, preventing cross-contamination with the general population. But when you strip away the jargon, the truth is impossible to ignore. They weren't trying to stop these bloodlines, they were trying to cultivate them, and the Whitakers were their crown jewel. The files show visits to the Whitaker property as early as 1929, government officials posing as agricultural surveyors, church representatives, even traveling salesmen, all of them leaving notes about the family's condition, their rituals, their births. One chilling entry from 1948 reads, "Subject SMW identified as optimal vessel. Recommend observation. No interference until term." SMW Sarah May Whitaker. She had been marked decades before her pregnancy. So the question is this: how did the government know? How see? Would they predict which child in which family would carry the optimal anomaly? Was it coincidence, or were these families seeded long before, shaped like clay into a design none of them understood? The answer may lie in a file labeled Heritage Program, Restricted. Its contents have never been fully released, but fragments describe selective pairings, coerced unions, even rumors of strangers introduced into these bloodlines at key moments, outsiders chosen not to dilute but to correct, to steer the mutations toward a desired end. In other words, the Whitakers were not merely the victims of their own doctrine. They were part of a breeding program, a program that blurred the line between human history and something else, something older, something not entirely human. When the men in black took Sarah May's child in 1971, they weren't collecting an accident. They were collecting the result of more than a century of design. And if Pattern X is real, if the files are authentic, then the Whitakers are not the only family carrying the weight of this secret. They were simply the most complete. The circle wasn't theirs alone, it was part of something much bigger, something still alive. Pattern X was never meant to be seen by ordinary eyes. The files that leaked in fragments during the late 1980s weren't just medical records. They were blueprints of a machinery that had been operating for decades in the shadows of American society. To understand how deep it went, you need to see where those files led. The term that appeared again and again wasn't genetics, mutation, or even disease. The word was heritage, a program buried under layers of bureaucratic code, its funding disguised as agricultural subsidies, rural electrification grants, and public health initiatives. On the surface, harmless, but the paper trail tells another story. Money flowed from agencies with names you'd recognize: the Department of Agriculture, the National Institutes of Health, the Department of Education. But when auditors traced it further, it terminated in entities that didn't officially exist. One codename appeared repeatedly: the Heritage Program. The Heritage Program's mission statement, if you can call it that, was chilling in its simplicity: to identify, isolate, and preserve anomalous bloodlines carrying non-standard heritable traits. That word, preserve, should send a shiver down your spine, because it meant these families were not viewed as victims, they were viewed as resources. And who oversaw this preservation? Not scientists in lab coats, not doctors or social workers, but men tied to far older institutions, churches with roots in Europe, secretive fraternal orders with symbols of spirals, eyes, and circles carved into their architecture. The program wasn't just scientific, it was ritualistic, bureaucracy cloaked in belief. The files contained transcripts of closed-door meetings. In one dated 1959, a speaker identified only as Dr. V argued that the Whitakers were approaching culmination and should be monitored daily. Another, labeled Carter Committee, c. 1965, discussed the ethical risk of allowing Pattern X subjects to intermingle with the general population. Their conclusion: containment at all costs. But containment didn't mean isolation, it meant control. Families were given just enough support to survive, but never enough to leave their valleys. Welfare checks kept them tethered. Visits from health inspectors ensured the pregnancies were recorded, monitored, and sometimes, though this part is still disputed, manipulated. There are whispers that injections were given under the guise of vaccinations, substances designed not to cure but to accelerate mutations. And here's where the conspiracy cuts deeper. Because those injections, those quiet interventions, didn't just occur in Appalachia, they occurred in native reservations, in orphanages, in state-run facilities for the mentally ill. Everywhere society had turned its gaze away, the Heritage Program had slipped in, always searching, always preserving, always tightening the circle. So what was the end goal? What did they believe they were cultivating? The files never say directly, but scattered notes hint at an obsession with convergence, a point at which the bloodlines would fold back enough times, tighten enough circles, to produce something beyond human, a vessel not for life as we know it, but for essence, for presence. In one particularly disturbing memo, an anonymous author wrote, "The human form is temporary, the circle is eternal, the blood is the vessel, through it the source returns." The source. That same word Joshua Whitaker scribbled in his journals a century earlier, the same word the men in black whispered to each other when they thought no one was listening. Whatever the source was, it wasn't God in the way preachers described on Sunday mornings. It was older, hungrier. And here's the part most people miss. The Whitakers weren't chosen by accident. They were positioned. Their land, their isolation, their doctrine, all of it was guided, nudged, protected, because the circle can only close in silence, away from the eyes of the world. So when Sarah May gave birth in 1971, it wasn't the end of a family's madness, it was the unveiling of a plan that had been waiting generations. And if Pattern X was cultivated, not contained, then ask yourself, how many other families are still out there carrying children not of chance, but of design? Families you pass in the grocery store, families whose children don't speak, families whose blood has been marked by the Heritage Program, waiting for their culmination. Because the circle doesn't just close in one place, it closes everywhere. When the federal agents sealed the incubator and vanished with the child, something inside the Whitaker family broke. For 100 years they had worshipped the circle, breeding and bleeding themselves into its twisted geometry. They had endured ridicule from outsiders, physical deformities, the death of countless infants, all because they believed their suffering was the sacrifice required to bring forth the culmination. And then, after 6 days of reverence, prayers, and rituals, their perfect one was stolen. Witnesses say the hospital corridors echoed with their wailing, but it wasn't grief the way you and I understand it. It wasn't mourning a lost baby, it was closer to rage, closer to blasphemy, as if God himself had reached down and mocked their generations of devotion. The eldest of them, a man named Jacob Whitaker, Sarah May's grandfather, was heard chanting in a dialect the nurses couldn't understand. His eyes rolled back, his tongue worked in strange patterns, and when the agents pushed him aside, he spat a single phrase in English that still chills the few who remember it. "The circle has been broken. The circle must be closed." Within hours, the Whitakers were gone. They gathered Sarah May's body, burned her belongings, and returned to the mountain compound. Locals said the dirt road to their hollow was blocked by felled trees within days. Hunters who wandered too close claimed they saw men carrying rifles, patrolling like soldiers. By winter, the Whitakers had vanished into their land, as if the mountains had swallowed them whole. But silence doesn't mean nothing happened. The Heritage Program kept watching. Field notes recovered decades later describe strange lights in the valley, chants that carried for miles, and bonfires that burned with an unnatural blue flame. The Whitakers, deprived of their culmination, had turned their devotion into fury. They began breeding faster. Younger girls were forced into pregnancies at earlier ages. The rotation system, once methodical, became frantic, as though they believed another culmination could be forced into existence through sheer volume. But here's the part that even the program found unnerving. The family stopped recording births. For a century, the Whitakers kept meticulous genealogies, pages of charts, diagrams, scribbles, all of it documenting the twisted knots of their bloodline. After 1971, those records ended. The Heritage Program had no way of knowing how many children were being born, how many survived, or what those children looked like. The circle had turned inward, away from oversight, away from containment. By the late 1970s, rumors spread that something else now lived in the valley. Truckers on the back road swore they saw figures along the tree line at night. Not people, not animals, something between. School teachers in the nearest town reported children who disappeared after being pulled out of class by relatives no one could identify. Hunters spoke of finding symbols carved into trees, spirals, circles, faces with too many eyes. And then came the disappearances. Between 1975 and 1982, at least 14 people went missing within a 20-mile radius of the Whitaker land. Most were transients, hitchhikers or drifters, people no one looked for. But a few were locals, 2 teenage brothers, a postal worker, a young woman who was last seen walking home from her waitress shift. None were ever found. The sheriff's office opened investigations, but nothing stuck. Search parties entered the valley only to find abandoned cabins, rotting barns, and silence so heavy it pressed against the skin. Dogs refused to enter. Compasses spun wildly, radios cut out. It was as if the land itself had been infected by the family's madness. But the Whitakers were not gone. They had changed. Instead of being subjects of a secret program, they had become something more dangerous, keepers of a wound they were determined to close by any means. One declassified memo, dated 1984, summed it up in 4 words. The circle is weaponized. The family no longer prayed for culmination. They no longer waited for the perfect one. They began to act as if the culmination had already happened, and the child, though stolen, had left its essence among them. They called themselves the carriers. Every pregnancy was now seen as carrying a fragment of the lost child. Every new birth was a shard of the perfect one waiting to be assembled again. What does it mean to grow up believing you are not a person, but a piece of something greater, that your life is meaningless except as part of a larger form that will one day awaken? That is what the Whitaker children were told from birth. And if you think that makes them victims, yes, they were. But victims can become executioners. By the late 1980s, reports surfaced of men emerging from the valley to barter with local farmers. They were tall, pale, with features that seemed blurred. Like their faces didn't know which ancestor to belong to. They spoke in broken English, traded carved objects for tools, and always asked the same question: "Have you seen the circle?" The Heritage Program recorded these encounters with growing alarm, because what the Whitakers were building now wasn't just a bloodline, it was a doctrine, By the mid-1980s, the Whitakers were no longer a family. They were a sect. They had taken their grief, their rage, and their shattered promise of culmination, and they had forged it into something harder, sharper, more dangerous. Outsiders called them hill people, inbreds, backwoods degenerates, but inside the valley, they called themselves the carriers. The name carried weight. To be a carrier meant you bore not just blood, but essence. You weren't an individual. You were a shard of the stolen child, a fragment of the perfect one scattered when the circle was broken. Your body was temporary. Your deformities, your pain, your suffering, they weren't flaws. They were symbols, signs that the blood was reshaping itself. Every crooked bone, every extra finger, every blind eye was proof that the essence had survived, that it was rewriting them piece by piece. The elders preached that one day the fragments would gather again, not in one body, but in many, a living circle, an organism of flesh and belief, a human hive. They said the stolen child had not been taken from them, it had been multiplied. Its whisper lived in each of them, and when the time came, those whispers would align into a single voice. Imagine growing up inside that doctrine. Imagine being told your stutter, your limp, your malformed jaw were not curses but blessings. That you were not broken, you were holy. That your suffering was proof you were chosen. What kind of man does that create? Not one who seeks escape, not one who looks to the outside world for salvation. It creates zealots, fanatics, carriers. And this is where the story turns from grotesque biology into psychological warfare, because belief is more dangerous than blood. The Heritage Program had monitored mutations before. They had catalogued deformities, mapped genealogies, taken samples, but they had never faced something like this, a self-conscious, tainted ideology feeding off its own pain, immune to shame, immune to ridicule. Records from a 1987 field report describe a chilling encounter. A program agent posing as a census worker gained entry into the valley. He found not squalor but structure, rituals timed with the moon, children schooled not in reading or arithmetic but in chants, symbols carved into wood, into stone, into flesh, circles within circles, spirals, faces that bled into each other, and in the center of the compound, a wooden effigy, a spiral-bodied figure with 3 faces and too many arms, the child reborn in iconography. The agent noted something else, something worse. The carriers weren't just breeding, they were recruiting. Women from outside the valley, drifters, runaways, addicts, women no one would miss, were lured in with promises of belonging, of family, of salvation. Once inside, escape was impossible. Their children too became carriers. The blood diluted, yes, but the doctrine grew stronger. The Heritage Program began to panic. If the Whitakers were multiplying faster than they could be contained, the circle might spread. A doctrine like that, wrapped in secrecy and ritual, could leap from valley to valley like fire through dry grass. And fire cannot be reasoned with. What frightened the program most wasn't the deformities, it wasn't the mutations, it was the whispers. Because multiple reports, independent, corroborated, claimed the carriers sometimes spoke in unison, entire groups, 20 or 30 of them, chanting the same phrase at the same moment with no leader, no signal, no hesitation, as though something inside them had synchronized. The circle closes, the circle closes, the circle closes. These weren't rehearsed performances. They happened spontaneously, mid-conversation, mid-task, as though the fragments inside each carrier had aligned for just a second, tuning into a frequency no outsider could hear. Witnesses described the effect as paralyzing, like the air itself vibrated, like reality bent for a heartbeat. What does that mean? Science doesn't have a word for it. Faith does. Possession, invocation, convergence. The Heritage Program tried to rationalize it. They called it collective psychosis, behavioral contagion. But behind closed doors, in the margins of the declassified files, other words appear, ancient words, words scratched into notebooks by terrified men who realized science had no grip here. Demon, tulpa, Egregore, the carriers weren't just preserving a bloodline anymore, they were building a host, and the host was waking up. By 1988, the Heritage Program had lost its patience. For decades, they had treated the Whitakers like a laboratory, subjects to be catalogued, samples to be harvested, files to be stamped, classified, and shelved. But the rise of the carriers changed everything. The family wasn't just mutating, they were multiplying. Worse, their doctrine had become infectious. The program knew what the public didn't. Belief spreads faster than any virus, and once belief hardens into identity, it can't be killed with bullets. Still, the order came down. Neutralization. On October 12, 1988, a convoy of unmarked vehicles rolled into Roanoke County, Virginia. Inside were men who didn't wear uniforms but moved like soldiers. They carried rifles equipped with sound suppressors, flamethrowers, and cases marked with biohazard symbols. The official story, if anyone asked, was a disease control operation, eradication of contaminated livestock. No one would ask too many questions in Appalachia. But when the men reached the Whitaker Valley, they didn't find livestock. They found resistance. Imagine this. Men trained in urban warfare. Men who had fought in Vietnam, entering a hollow where the very trees seemed alive with whispers. Dogs refused to move forward. Compasses spun wildly. Radiostatic drowned commands. Then came the chanting. At first faint like wind threading through the mountains, then louder, dozens of voices in unison. The circle closes, the circle closes, the circle closes. The soldiers pushed forward, but the valley itself fought back. Logs rolled onto the dirt road, spike traps hidden in leaves. Fires erupted from nowhere, lighting up symbols carved into the ground. Spirals, faces, overlapping eyes. Every movement was watched, every step echoed. One declassified after-action report describes the moment they breached the compound. What they found wasn't chaos, it was order. The carriers stood in rows, children in the front, elders in the back, their faces pale, their eyes unfocused, their mouths murmuring in time with each other. Not fear, not panic, readiness, as if they had known this moment would come for generations. The lead operative ordered them to disperse. No one moved. He shouted again. That's when the children started laughing. Not one or two, but all of them, at the same instant, the same pitch. Witnesses described it as inhuman, layered, like a choir collapsing into static. Then it broke. The soldiers opened fire. The compound erupted in smoke, fire, and screams. But here's the part that still divides experts today. The carriers did not scatter. They did not run. They advanced. Unarmed, barefoot, their bodies riddled with bullets, they kept moving forward. Some collapsed only to rise again seconds later, staggering with broken bones, chanting through mouths full of blood. The firefight lasted 7 minutes. When it ended, half the compound was burning. 43 Whitakers lay dead, but 13 men from the strike team were also lost, throats torn out, bodies burned, some simply gone without trace. The program called it a success. They declared the Whitaker line neutralized, the circle broken permanently. Official documents marked the family extinct. But whispers from inside the valley tell a different story, because amid the bodies and ash, a group of carriers slipped into the mountains. Children, adolescents, pregnant women. They vanished into the caves, into the tunnels only the Whitakers knew. And when the fires burned out, voices could still be heard on the wind at night. Not mourning, not prayer, but a promise. The circle closes. The Heritage Program pulled out, leaving the valley scorched but not silent. To this day, no one knows how many carriers escaped, how many regrouped, or where they went. Some say they spread into other hollows, other forgotten corners of Appalachia. Some say they left the mountains entirely, blending into towns, cities, even suburbs, teaching their children to hide until the time came. The program's files end abruptly in 1989. The operation was buried under layers of bureaucracy, reclassified as environmental remediation. The men who carried it out were sworn to silence, but the few who spoke years later all said the same thing. We didn't kill them, we woke them up. And if the carriers are awake, then the question is not whether the circle closes, the question is when. When the flames died down in the Whitaker Hollow, the Heritage Program marked its ledgers with a single word: extinct. But extinction is neat, clean. It fits in a file drawer. What happened in reality was messy, fractured, viral. The carriers who slipped through the tunnels did not vanish into smoke. They moved. Some into neighboring hollows, some into abandoned coal camps, some into the veins of small towns where people ask fewer questions than they should. They became shadows, but shadows cast by something still burning. The first place they surfaced was a town called Bramble Creek, 12 miles east. At first it seemed ordinary: men looking for work, women taking jobs as cleaners, children slipping into the public school system. They said they were cousins from out of state, kinfolk from Kentucky. People believed it. In rural towns, you don't interrogate family trees. But there were signs, subtle at first. Teachers reported children who stared too long without blinking, who laughed at odd moments, who drew circles and spirals compulsively in their notebooks. A minister claimed his congregation had been infiltrated by mocking spirits after a group of pale newcomers joined his Sunday service. He swore their voices in hymnals never matched the melody, but wove a second tune beneath it. By 1992, 3 children had gone missing in Bramble Creek. Officially, they were runaways. Unofficially, their shoes were found on the riverbank arranged in a perfect circle. From Bramble Creek, the carriers spread farther. They learned invisibility, not by magic, but by mimicry. Some took jobs in slaughterhouses, some in factories, some in roadside diners. They blended, they bred, and always, quietly, they taught their children the doctrine of the circle. Here's what you need to understand. The doctrine didn't stay locked in the hollow. It adapted. It evolved. In the valley, it was sacred geometry and whispered chants. In the towns, it became something else. Whispers disguised as nursery rhymes, chants hidden in playground games, rituals slipped into sleepovers. Children carried the circle into classrooms. A jump rope chant that always ended on the 12th beat. A game of tag where the center child never moved. Teachers dismissed it as nonsense, but patterns matter, and the carriers knew how to plant them. By the mid-1990s, cases began appearing across Appalachia, clusters of children drawing the same spirals, repeating the same phrases, eyes clouding over, as if they were listening to something far away. When asked why, their answers were eerily consistent: because the circle is closing. It didn't stop with children. The carriers infiltrated institutions too. Social workers, prison guards, nurses, people in positions where they could influence the vulnerable, where they could guide decisions unnoticed. A prison doctor in West Virginia was later found to have altered vaccination records for dozens of inmates, though no charges were filed. A foster care worker in Kentucky disappeared after it was discovered. Nearly all of the children she placed ended up in households tied, however faintly, to the Whitaker line. The Heritage Program tracked these anomalies obsessively. Their files from the 1990s read less like science and more like folklore studies: diagrams of playground games, transcriptions of rhymes, photographs of chalk circles drawn on asphalt. The analysts were terrified, though the reports never say it outright, but you can read it between the lines. The circle is no longer contained geographically, it is mimetic. Think about that word, mimetic. The carriers didn't just escape into the world, they infected it. The doctrine was no longer only in the blood, it was in the air, the words, the games of children who had never set foot in a hollow. And once a belief becomes mimetic, it can't be eradicated with bullets or fire. You can't shoot a rhyme, you can't burn a symbol once it's etched into a child's mind. That was the Heritage Program's true failure. They thought they could destroy a family. Instead, they had created a diaspora. By the turn of the millennium, the Whitakers were everywhere and nowhere, working cash registers, driving trucks, cleaning motel rooms, ordinary faces, ordinary jobs. But behind closed doors, the chants continued. The doctrine spread. And in the silence of the night, families who had no blood ties to the Whitakers at all began whispering the same promise: the circle closes. The Heritage Program learned its lesson the hard way. Fire and rifles could destroy bodies, but they couldn't cauterize belief. By 1990, their analysts had written the phrase mimetic contagion into nearly every field report. The circle wasn't a bloodline anymore, it was an idea. And ideas don't die when you burn a compound. They spread, they mutate, they hide in places even satellites can't see. The program's solution was not another raid. It was subtler and far darker. They called it Project Stillwater. The logic was simple. If the circle had become a story, then the only way to stop it was to drown that story in noise. Stillwater's mandate was to take every sighting, every whisper, every report of strange chanting or spiral symbols, and bury it beneath ridicule. UFOs, satanic panic, tabloid hysteria. If a schoolteacher said her students were chanting about circles, she was dismissed as paranoid. If a sheriff found shoes arranged in a spiral, the official report called it prank mischief. Stillwater worked through media. Reporters were fed disinformation. Experts were coached to appear on talk shows, dismissing backwoods cult rumors as superstition. The few journalists who pushed harder found their careers derailed by sudden accusations, IRS audits, or quiet threats. The program didn't need to erase the circle from the world. They only needed to convince the world it was never there. But propaganda wasn't enough. Stillwater also weaponized psychology. Beginning in 1992, psychologists tied to the program were embedded in rural school districts, ostensibly to study childhood resilience. Their real task was identifying children who exhibited carrier behaviors, those compulsive spiral drawings, those sudden chanting fits. When identified, these children were funneled into special education tracks, designed not to help them, but to disrupt them. Therapy session. Focused on breaking group identity. Punishments fell hardest when multiple children acted in unison. The goal wasn't rehabilitation, it was fragmentation. In declassified notes, one Stillwater psychiatrist described the strategy bluntly. The circle thrives on synchronicity. Break the rhythm, break the faith. Some children were medicated heavily, others were relocated entirely, quietly moved to foster homes, their names erased from school rosters. Did it work? Temporarily, but belief doesn't die under sedation, it waits. And the program knew this, which is why Stillwater's darkest component wasn't psychological, it was cultural. The analysts realized that the circle was a pattern, and patterns could be redirected, so they began flooding the same towns with competing stories: Slender Man, Bloody Mary, urban legends crafted to mimic the rhythms of carrier doctrine but drain them of power. Creepy, yes. Frightening, yes. But hollow. If a child whispered, "The circle closes," they could be drowned out by 10 others whispering about a faceless man in the woods. The goal wasn't to stop belief, it was to dilute it, to scatter it across dozens of harmless myths until the original doctrine withered. At least that was the plan. But belief doesn't vanish when you redirect it, it mutates. The carrier children adapted quickly, weaving urban legends into their doctrine. Slender Man became another face of the child. Bloody Mary, another mask of the circle. Instead of erasing the myth, Stillwater expanded it. They gave the carriers more skins to wear. And here's the most chilling detail. The program knew. Internal memos acknowledged that the doctrine was incorporating the very propaganda meant to kill it. One analyst wrote, "The circle is a parasite. It consumes every attempt to contain it and makes it part of itself. We are feeding the thing we're trying to starve." Till what? Didn't end. It couldn't. By the late 1990s, its operations expanded into early internet culture. Chat rooms, message boards, creepypasta, flood the zone, always. Hide the circle in a haystack of fake rituals and invented monsters. But the more noise they made, the more the signal spread. Because here's the truth, the Heritage program never admitted publicly. The circle doesn't need everyone to believe, it only needs enough, and enough was already out there. Every town has children who draw spirals in their notebooks. Every schoolyard has games that feel older than they should. Every community has houses people whisper about but never approach. Stillwater may have blurred the outlines, but the circle was still there, waiting, humming, whispering beneath the static. And the carriers? They didn't see Stillwater as suppression, they saw it as proof the outside world was trying to silence them, proof that their whispers mattered, proof that the circle was closing. Her name in the files is case number 19743, but in Bramble Creek she was just Emily, 11 years old, the daughter of a waitress and a coal miner. Nothing remarkable until she disappeared in the spring of 1995. Officially, Emily was listed as a runaway. That's what the sheriff wrote, but the truth, pieced together from witness interviews and one half-burned notebook found years later, is far stranger. It started small. She came home from school humming a tune her mother didn't recognize. The melody was simple, looping, with no beginning or end. When asked where she'd learned it, Emily shrugged. From the Circle Kids. Her mother assumed she meant classmates, but no one in Emily's class admitted to knowing the song. Teachers dismissed it as make-believe. Yet the tune lingered, threading through her every hum, every idle moment, as if it had been stitched into her memory. Weeks later, her mother found drawings stuffed under the mattress, spirals, overlapping circles, and stick figures with too many eyes. On one page, written in a shaky hand, "I am not me, I am part." That phrase would later appear in multiple Stillwater files, always linked to children suspected of carrier influence. It was the mantra of indoctrination. Neighbors last saw Emily walking into the woods at dusk, barefoot, her eyes unfocused, as if following a sound no one else could hear. Search parties scoured the hollows for days. Dogs lost the trail near an abandoned mine shaft. The sheriff closed the case quietly, marking it voluntary disappearance. But the notebook tells another story. Inside, amid the spirals and phrases, were fragments of experiences too coherent to be fantasy. She wrote of a house with no windows where the air tasted like metal. She described a woman with a twisted spine who stroked her hair and called her daughter Fragment. She mentioned other children, some older, some younger, who recited chants in unison until their voices blended into a single tone. "When we speak together," she wrote, "it feels like someone else is inside me, listening through my mouth." The most chilling entry is dated 2 days before she vanished. "They say my eyes are too straight, my blood too thin, but the child needs all pieces. They said I can still carry it if I let the circle inside. I think I already did. When I hum, it hums with me." The notebook ends abruptly, pages torn out. The last intact words, scrawled in the corner, read, "The circle closes." What happened to Emily after that is speculation. Some locals whispered she became a bride, a carrier term for outsiders brought into the Doctrine through ritual rather than blood. Others said she was buried in the mountains, her essence absorbed into the circle. But one detail suggests otherwise. In 2003, 8 years after Emily's disappearance, a schoolteacher in Knoxville reported a strange incident. A new student, pale, withdrawn, 12 years old, began humming a tune during recess, the same looping melody. When asked where she learned it, she replied, "My mother sang it to me." That girl's mother, listed on the enrollment forms as Emily Whitaker. DNA tests were never conducted. The Heritage Program's files on the case remain redacted with entire pages blacked out, but the implication is terrifying. Emily did not die in the hollow. She was remade, absorbed, transformed into a carrier herself, and then released back into the world, not as a victim, but as a vector. If true, Emily's story proves something the program had feared but never confirmed. The circle doesn't just bind bloodlines. It recruits, it rewrites, it consumes outsiders, folds them in, and then sends them back out carrying the Doctrine like a contagion. And if a child like Emily could vanish from an ordinary town, only to reappease years later as something unrecognizable, then the circle isn't confined to the mountains anymore. It's already inside the neighborhoods we think are safe. Knoxville, 2003, a city of strip malls, high school football and Friday night diners, about as far from the Appalachian hollows as you could imagine. Safe, ordinary, forgettable. That's why the Heritage Program nearly missed her. Emily, if it truly was Emily, slipped into the city unnoticed, carrying a new surname, a forged birth certificate, and a child who bore her eyes. No one questioned the paperwork. No one asked how a 17-year-old from nowhere had suddenly become a mother. She blended in, like a shadow that didn't belong but never drew attention. Her daughter Lily was quiet. She spoke in short phrases, often repeating words until they lost meaning. Teachers assumed developmental delays, but it was the humming that unsettled them. A droning tune, circular, endless, sometimes sung in harmony with voices no one else could hear. At first it was dismissed as imagination. Children invent friends after all. But other kids began humming it too. By Christmas break, half her class could reproduce the tune perfectly. Parents joked about it being catchy. They didn't see the way the children's eyes glazed when they sang together. They didn't notice the subtle synchronization of breath, posture, even blinking. One teacher did. Mrs. Henson, a veteran of 30 years. She'd grown up in the Appalachian foothills, where whispers of the Whitakers still lingered like smoke. When she heard the melody, her face drained of color. She recognized it. She'd heard it as a girl, carried on the wind from a funeral in a hollow the locals avoided. A sound that didn't fade with distance, but grew sharper the closer you tried to block it out. Mrs. Henson filed a report with the school board. Nothing came of it. Days later, she resigned abruptly, citing personal health. Her replacement lasted 3 weeks before transferring. The file ends there. But the program had eyes everywhere. A field agent embedded in the Knoxville Health Department noticed an anomaly. Clusters of children reporting identical dreams. Dreams of spirals, of rooms with no doors, of voices that weren't theirs. The pattern matched archived Stillwater cases exactly. When investigators traced it back, they found the same name surfacing again and again. Emily, sometimes Whitaker, sometimes another alias. Always with Lily at her side, always moving apartments every 6 months, as if following invisible instructions. The program finally intervened in 2005. Surveillance was ordered, Emily was followed, filmed, her phone tapped. But the footage raised more questions than it answered. She was ordinary, almost boring, except when the humming began. Then, in every cafe, park, or laundromat she entered, others unconsciously picked it up. Mothers rocked infants in rhythm. Strangers tapped feet in time, a dozen lives stitched together by a melody no one remembered learning. What unnerved the analysts wasn't the song itself, it was the aftermath. Within weeks, those exposed to prolonged contact with Emily and Lily began reporting subtle identity shifts. They adopted phrases from the Doctrine without knowing their origin. They drew spirals absent-mindedly. Some began refusing medical care, saying, "The circle heals." The program realized too late what this meant. The circle had adapted. It was no longer bound to isolated bloodlines in the mountains. It had found a carrier, biological and ideological, capable of transmitting its essence like a virus, and the infection spread not through touch, but through sound. Emily wasn't just a survivor of the Whitaker Hollow. She was its emissary, a walking breach. Proof that the Doctrine could slip into modern cities disguised as lullabies, homework doodles, casual conversation. Proof that the circle wasn't dying. It was evolving. Some files claim Millie was eventually neutralized. Others say she vanished before the program could act, leaving behind only a spiral carved into a school desk, so deep it cut through the wood. But there's one field report, dated 2011, that the program tried to bury. It describes a family in Atlanta, hundreds of miles away, with 2 children who hummed the same looping song in perfect unison. Their mother, a woman in her 30s with pale skin, yellow-tinted eyes, and a smile that never seemed to fade. The agent's note at the bottom reads, "She called herself Emily." By 2012, the Heritage Program no longer called the Whitakers a family. They called them a vector. The Emily case proved something the program had whispered about for decades, that the circle wasn't simply a product of backwoods superstition and genetic obsession. It was a delivery system, a mechanism for transmitting thought, behavior, and belief in ways that bypassed reason entirely. One analyst put it bluntly in a redacted briefing, "This isn't genetics, it's memetics." The humming, the spirals, the mantras, these weren't random quirks of an inbred clan. They were technologies of control, ancient tools designed to bypass the conscious mind and write directly into the subconscious, tools far older than the Whitakers themselves. That revelation was dangerous. Because the program recognized those tools, they mirrored patterns found in MK-Ultra experiments from the 1950s. They echoed research into subliminal indoctrination, crowd hypnosis, and music-driven trance states. The same methods the US government had once tried and failed to weaponize. The chilling question was simple. How had an isolated mountain family mastered them first? And the answer was worse. Maybe they hadn't. Maybe the Whitakers were never inventors, but custodians, vessels preserving fragments of a system that predated America, predated Appalachia, perhaps even predated recorded history. The program shifted from surveillance to containment. Entire counties were quietly monitored. Schools were screened for spiral drawings. Songs were recorded, dissected, erased from archives. But by then it was too late. The circle wasn't in the mountains anymore. It was in playgrounds, church choirs, radio jingles, whispering, looping, embedding itself into culture like a parasite the host never notices until it's too late. The Whitakers weren't just a story of inbreeding, they were the story of infiltration. The further the heritage program dug, the less the Whitakers looked like an accident of Appalachia, and the more they resembled an echo of something far older. Archaeological files, sealed under cultural sensitivity, revealed petroglyphs across the Blue Ridge carved centuries before European settlement, spirals upon spirals, etched deep into stone, identical to the doodles children exposed to the Doctrine drew instinctively. No language, no words, just the circle, repeating. But the resonance didn't stop there. In Mesopotamian tablets, priests described the chant that eats the mind. In Mesoamerican codices, colonial scribes recorded rituals where children were taught to hum endless loops until their eyes rolled back and they spoke in borrowed voices. The same pattern, different continents, different ages, always hidden, always suppressed, always resurfacing. The program's linguists noted something disturbing. The Whitakers' chants carried syllables with no traceable origin. Not English, not Cherokee, not Germanic or Celtic, a sound family that should not exist, yet persisted, unchanged, for centuries. One analyst broke protocol and made a chilling suggestion. This isn't a family tradition. This is a survival of pre-human programming. The circle isn't invented, it's remembered. And with that came the darkest realization of all. The Whitakers weren't the first generation to try to perfect the circle. They were simply the last known keepers of a system designed to move through time, embedding itself in blood, in song, in bone, waiting for hosts to carry it forward. A parasite, a code, a seed. And now it was awake again. By 2015, the Heritage Program stopped asking whether the circle had survived. The evidence was overwhelming. The real question was how deeply it had already infiltrated modern life. One case began in a rural elementary school where investigators catalogued 143 spiral carvings in desks across 3 classrooms. None of the children could explain why they drew them. "It just feels right," one 7-year-old said. In a suburban church choir, the program identified hymns containing looping melodic structures mathematically identical to the Whitaker chant. Congregants reported feeling weightless during singing, some entering trance-like states without realizing it. Worse still, analysts reviewing national advertising discovered that certain commercial jingles used melodic phrasing so close to circle patterns that they produced measurable neurological effects, entrainment of brainwaves into the same frequencies recorded in Whitaker children decades before. Coincidence or contamination? The program's conclusion was stark. The circle was no longer rural, no longer obscure. Its patterns had replicated themselves into schools, pulpits, radios, and screens. Not consciously, not always deliberately, but effectively. Control was no longer achieved by chains or guns. It was achieved by rhythm, by melody, by symbols children couldn't resist drawing, by words repeated until they bypassed thought. The circle had slipped the hollows. It had clothed itself in culture, and in doing so, it had become invisible. The parasite was no longer confined to a family tree, it was in the bloodstream of a nation. The Heritage Program's psychiatric files tell the story most clearly. Exposure to circle patterns didn't just unsettle, it rewrote. Men were the most vulnerable, perhaps because the Doctrine prized them as vessels, or perhaps because the patterns targeted something buried in male cognition. Whatever the reason, the results were terrifyingly consistent. Subjects exposed to repeated humming loops or spiral imagery reported dissociation within days. One factory worker in Ohio described it as watching myself from outside my body, like someone else was piloting. Others reported intrusive thoughts not their own. We, they said, instead of I. A plural voice creeping into their speech, as though the circle was colonizing their identity. Some turned violent. Case notes describe sudden rages, followed by eerie calm. One subject carved a spiral into his forearm with a pocket knife, whispering, "The circle heals." But not all experiences were destructive. A minority reported visions, grand architectures of light, tunnels winding infinitely, beings made of sound. They spoke of clarity, of belonging, of feeling part of something vast and eternal. To the program, that was the most dangerous effect of all, because it wasn't madness, it was recruitment. Once a subject tasted that belonging, they stopped resisting. They became missionaries, carriers, spreading the hum in workplaces, bars, homes. The circle didn't need to convince anyone. It needed only to show them the illusion of unity and let their minds dissolve willingly. What the program feared most was not the broken men, but the smiling ones. The ones who said they had finally found peace. By 2018, the Heritage program knew it was losing. Every intervention, every surveillance op, every redacted school report, every neutralization only slowed the spread. It never stopped it. The circle adapted faster than they could erase. So the program made a choice it had avoided for decades: erasure. Operation Stillpoint was authorized under a national security directive buried in Cold War archives. Its objective: identify all known vectors, isolate them, and destroy every trace of the doctrine. Files, recordings, even witnesses, nothing could remain. Teams descended on counties in Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia. Churches were burned in accidental electrical fires. Entire school archives vanished in late-night transfers. Families were relocated under new names, their memories rewritten with fabricated trauma to explain the gaps. But the most chilling act came in 2019, when the program targeted the living carriers. Men institutionalized for violent psychosis were quietly overdosed. Choir groups flagged for harmonic contamination were broken apart by manufactured scandals. And then there were the children, those who hummed in unison. They were scattered across foster systems, their files marked with bright red tags, "Monitor until silence." Officially, Stillpoint was a success. The program declared the circle contained, if not neutralized. Reports were stamped, shelved, and locked behind layers of clearance. But in the margins of one final memo, scrawled in handwriting unlike the author's, were 3 words that chilled even hardened analysts: "The circle opens." The Heritage program's archive ends in silence. No new reports after 2020, no updates, no surviving agents willing to speak. Some say the program was dissolved. Others whisper it was absorbed, its staff and data folded into the very thing they tried to destroy. But the circle didn't vanish. It multiplied. Listen closely and you'll hear it. In playgrounds where children chant nonsense songs that loop endlessly, their voices sinking without effort. In megachurches where entire congregations sway in rhythm, eyes glazed, lips moving in unison. In pop songs designed to be catchy, yet structured in patterns eerily identical to Whitaker chants. Look at the margins of notebooks, the graffiti on bathroom walls, the sketches left in bored students' homework, spirals upon spirals drawn by hands that never learned them. The circle no longer needs a hollow in Appalachia. It doesn't need the Whitakers. It doesn't even need bloodlines. It has what it always wanted: hosts, billions of them, singing, humming, drawing, whispering, unknowingly carrying the doctrine forward. Perhaps the program was right to fear, not because the circle was dangerous in the way of plagues or wars, but because it was seductive. It offered what every fractured soul craves: belonging. A unity so complete it erases loneliness, doubt, even identity itself. And maybe that's why the files end so abruptly, not because the circle was defeated, but because the program lost more than the battle. They lost themselves. Read long enough, and you'll feel it too. That pull, that hum, at the edge of silence, the circle opening inside your own thoughts. And when it does, you'll understand the final truth. The circle doesn't need to be found, it's already here.